When I moved into my new neighborhood, I was eager to make new friends and settle into my routine. My neighbors, the Johnsons, were the first to welcome me. They seemed like the ideal suburban couple, Jane with her warm, inviting smile, and Mark with his easygoing charm. So when they invited me over for dinner one evening, I was thrilled, unaware that the night would turn into a chilling experience I would never forget. Their house was just like mine, a cozy, modern home with a neatly kept lawn and a friendly atmosphere. As I walked up the path to their door, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the yard. Jane greeted me warmly and ushered me inside. The smell of delicious food filled the air, making my mouth water. The house was decorated with a mix of modern and antique furniture, creating a unique and cozy vibe. We sat in the living room, sipping wine and chatting about our jobs and the neighborhood. Jane excused herself to the kitchen to finish preparing dinner, leaving Mark and me to continue our conversation. I couldn't help but notice some peculiar items around the room: strange masks on the walls, odd trinkets on the shelves, and an ancient-looking mirror that seemed out of place in the otherwise contemporary decor. "Interesting collection you have here," I remarked, pointing to the mirror. Mark chuckled, though there was something off about his laugh. "Jane loves collecting unique pieces. She's particularly fond of items with a history." I felt a shiver run down my spine, but dismissed it as my imagination running wild. Soon, Jane called us to the dining room. The table was set beautifully, and the food looked and smelled amazing. We began eating, and the conversation turned to local folklore and ghost stories, which seemed fitting, given the eerie vibe I was starting to feel. As the evening wore on, the stories became more unsettling. Jane told a tale about a previous owner of the house who had mysteriously disappeared. Mark mentioned strange noises in the night, and objects moving on their own. I laughed nervously, trying to brush off the growing sense of unease. But then, something happened that made my blood run cold. The lights flickered, and for a moment, everything went dark. When they came back on, the atmosphere had changed. The room felt colder, and the shadows seemed to loom larger. Jane and Mark exchanged a glance that I couldn't quite decipher. I tried to steer the conversation back to safer topics, but they seemed intent on sharing more creepy stories. As we finished dessert, a loud thud came from upstairs, followed by a scraping sound. Jane's face went pale, and Mark's expression turned grim. "It's probably just the house settling," I said, trying to sound casual, though my heart was racing. Mark shook his head. "No, it's something else. We've heard it before." Jane stood up abruptly. "Excuse me for a moment." She hurried out of the room, leaving Mark and me in an uncomfortable silence. After what felt like an eternity, she returned, her face even paler than before. "I think it's time for you to go," she said, her voice trembling slightly. I didn't need to be told twice. I grabbed my coat and made my way to the door, feeling their eyes on me the entire time. As I stepped outside, I turned back to say goodbye, but the door was already closing. The walk back to my house was eerie, with the cold night air biting at my skin, and every shadow seeming to move. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every noise made me jump, and I kept replaying the strange events of the evening in my mind. The following morning, I decided to do some research on the house. What I found sent chills down my spine. The previous owner had indeed disappeared under mysterious circumstances, and there were numerous reports of paranormal activity from other residents over the years. I never went back to the Johnsons' house. Whenever I saw them in the neighborhood, they seemed perfectly normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. The strange, scary, and creepy encounter had left a lasting impression, one that made me wary of the friendly facade of suburban life.
When I moved into my new neighborhood, I was eager to make friends and become part of the community. My next-door neighbors, the Whitmans, were the first to welcome me. They seemed like a lovely couple, Martha with her warm smile and gentle demeanor, and George with his hearty laugh and friendly attitude. So when they invited me over for dinner one evening, I gladly accepted, not knowing that it would be a night I would never forget. Their house was charming, a classic suburban home with a neatly trimmed lawn and colourful flower beds. As I approached their door, the evening sun cast long shadows across the yard, creating an oddly eerie atmosphere despite the picturesque setting. Martha greeted me warmly, ushering me inside, where the smell of roasting meat and baked bread filled the air. The house was cozy, filled with antique furniture and family photographs, giving it a timeless quality. We sat in the dining room, a grand space with an ornate chandelier hanging above the table. George poured us each a glass of wine, and we made small talk as we waited for dinner to be served. Martha excused herself to the kitchen, and I took the opportunity to admire the room. There was something off about the decor of trinkets and peculiar artifacts that seemed out of place in an otherwise traditional setting. My curiosity piqued. I leaned closer to inspect a particularly strange-looking figurine, when George's voice broke the silence. "Quite the collection, isn't it?" he said, his eyes gleaming in the dim light. "Martha has a fascination with rare and unusual items." I nodded, feeling a slight unease creep over me. "They're certainly interesting. Where did you find them?" George leaned back in his chair, a strange smile playing on his lips. "Oh, here and there. We like to travel and pick up unique things. Each piece has a story." Martha returned with a large platter of roast beef and vegetables, and we began our meal. The food was delicious, but the conversation took a bizarre turn as they started sharing the stories behind their collection. Each artifact had a dark and twisted tale, involving mysterious deaths, cursed origins, and inexplicable phenomena. The more they spoke, the more uneasy I became. "Do you believe in the supernatural?" Martha asked suddenly, her eyes boring into mine. I hesitated, unsure how to respond. "I suppose anything is possible," I said cautiously. George chuckled, a sound that sent a shiver down my spine. "We've had our share of strange experiences, haven't we, dear?" Martha nodded, her expression serious. "This house, for example, has a history. It's said to be built on the site of an old burial ground. Sometimes, we hear voices or see things that can't be explained." As the evening wore on, the atmosphere grew more oppressive. The Whitman stories became more disturbing, and I found myself glancing around nervously, half expecting something to leap out of the shadows. I tried to steer the conversation to lighter topics, but they seemed intent on sharing every macabre detail of their lives. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Martha stood up and announced it was time for dessert. She brought out a beautifully decorated cake, but as she set it down, the lights flickered and dimmed. George muttered something under his breath, and Martha gave him a sharp look. "What was that?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Just an electrical issue," Martha said quickly. "This old house has its quirks." We ate in silence, the once delightful dinner now feeling like a surreal nightmare. As soon as I could politely excuse myself, I did. George walked me to the door, his smile never reaching his eyes. "Thank you for joining us," he said, his tone eerily calm. "We'll have to do this again sometime." I nodded mutely and hurried out into the night, the cool air a welcome relief from the oppressive atmosphere inside. As I walked back to my house, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I glanced back and saw the Whitmans standing at their window, their faces partially obscured by the curtains. That night, I lay in bed, unable to sleep. Every creak and groan of my own house seemed amplified, and my mind replayed the bizarre events of the evening. I finally drifted off just before dawn, only to be jolted awake by a loud thud, heart pounding. I rushed to the window and peered out, but there was nothing there. The following morning, I found a small package on my doorstep. There was no note, but I recognized a strange figurine had been examining at the Whitman's house. A chill ran down my spine as I picked it up, feeling an overwhelming sense of dread. I decided to move shortly after that night, unable to shake the unsettling feeling that the Whitmans were somehow watching me. Their strange and creepy stories, now a permanent fixture in my nightmares.
Living alone in my small, modern apartment had always been a comfort to me. I enjoyed the solitude, the quiet evenings with a book or a movie, and the occasional sounds of the city that lulled me to sleep. But one night, all that changed when a strange and creepy visitor appeared at my door. It was a Friday night, and I had just settled down with a cup of tea and my favorite thriller novel. The rain was tapping against the windows, and the distant rumble of thunder added to the cozy atmosphere. As the clock approached midnight, I heard a faint knock at the door. It was soft, almost hesitant, but in the silence of my apartment, it was unmistakable. I put down my book, feeling a twinge of unease. Who could be knocking at this hour? I checked the peephole, but saw nothing unusual, just the dimly lit hallway. Reluctantly, I opened the door a crack. Standing there was a man I had never seen before. He was tall and thin, with disheveled hair and eyes that seemed too large for his gaunt face. He wore an old, rain-soaked coat and carried a worn-out briefcase. "Can I help you?" I asked, my voice betraying my nervousness. The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he just stared at me, his eyes wide and unblinking. After what felt like an eternity, he finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I need to come in. It's important." Every instinct told me to close the door and lock it, but something in his voice, an urgency, a desperation, made me hesitate. "Why do you need to come in?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He looked around the hallway nervously before answering. "There's something outside. Something that's been following me. Please, you have to let me in." Despite my better judgment, I opened the door wider and allowed him to step inside. He entered quickly, shutting the door behind him with a sigh of relief. I noticed then how pale he was, his skin almost translucent under the dim lights of my apartment. "Thank you," he said, his voice trembling. "You have no idea what you've just saved me from." I was about to ask him to explain when the power suddenly went out, plunging us into darkness. The only light came from the occasional flash of lightning outside. The man seemed unfazed, as if he had expected it. "What is going on?" I demanded, my fear mounting. "Who are you, and what are you running from?" He took a deep breath, his eyes darting around the room. "My name is Thomas. I don't have much time to explain, but there's something out there, something that hunts in the darkness. It's been following me for days. Every night, it gets closer. Tonight, it was right behind me." A cold chill ran down my spine. "What do you mean, something? Like an animal?" He shook his head. "No, it's not an animal. It's something else. Something that shouldn't exist. It preys on fear, feeds on it. I don't know what it wants, but once it starts following you, it doesn't stop until it gets what it wants." Suddenly, There was a loud thud against the door, followed by a scraping sound. My heart pounded in my chest as I turned to look, but the darkness made it impossible to see anything. "What is that?" I whispered, barely able to speak. Thomas grabbed my arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "Stay away from the door. Whatever you do, don't open it." We stood there in the dark, listening to the terrifying sounds outside. The thudding and scraping continued, growing more insistent. It felt like hours, but it was probably only minutes. Finally, the noise stopped, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. Thomas relaxed slightly, though his eyes remained wary. "I think it's gone for now." Before I could respond, the lights flickered back on. Thomas looked at me with a mixture of gratitude and fear. "I need to keep moving. It will come back, and I can't stay in one place for too long." I nodded, too stunned to argue. As he turned to leave, he paused at the door. "Thank you. You've helped me more than you know. But be careful. Once it's seen you, it never truly leaves." With that, he disappeared into the night, leaving me alone with my racing thoughts. I locked the door and checked the windows, feeling a lingering sense of dread. The rain continued to pour outside, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, waiting for the darkness to return.